Now that we've spent some time talking about all the various different structural elements of the League of Nations and the variety of different memberships and comings and goings of memberships, this lesson is going to spend some time talking about the work of the League of Nations in the 1920s. Specifically, we're going to focus on some of the peacekeeping and border dispute issues, as well as some of the humanitarian and social achievements, and then finally focus on some of the limitations and failures of the League of Nations, specifically in the 1920s. Very, very, very quick recap for everybody. The League of Nations, of course, was formally established on the 10th of January 1920. I said 20th of January in the previous lesson. I meant the 10th of January 1920. And this was when the Covenant became effective by the ratification of the 42 nations that took place in 1919, stemming from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The earliest setback of the League of Nations, the initial setback, the setback before it even became a thing, was the fact that, of course, the US had not participated. If you're going to write an essay about the failures of the League of Nations, then one of the things that you're going to have to talk about is the fact the US had not joined. The US was seen as a cornerstone of the League of Nations. If I go back to the original slide, this sort of propaganda image, or the sort of satirical image, should I say, of the USA, the Keystone USA on the bridge, is one of the most famous images of the League of Nations that you will ever see. You will see it in every single exam, and you will see it in every single textbook. And it's true. You've got England, you've got Italy, you've got France building the bridge, but the keystone in the middle is the United States, and it was completely absent from the League of Nations. But despite that, the League of Nations did a number of things. The first things it began to do in the 1920s was a number of peacekeeping and border dispute successes. The League found quite modest successes, admittedly. These are not major issues in some regards, but they are still nevertheless important issues that were solved by the League of Nations. We have, for example, the Åland Islands dispute. This was a dispute over the Åland Islands between Sweden and Finland. Both Sweden and Finland accepted the arbitration of the League of Nations. They accepted that the League of Nations would come to a decision of it, and they accepted the result of this decision. In a similar vein, in 1921, the League arranged for a plebiscite to be voted upon and suggested the partition of the Upper Silesia region between Germany and Poland, which averted conflict in 1921. In 1925, we see the Greco-Bulgarian dispute, which saw Greece, in fact, withdraw following the League's order after invading Bulgaria, withdrawing from Bulgaria. So essentially, you have a dispute taking place between Greece and Bulgaria. Greece decided to try and invade Bulgaria. The League ordered them to withdraw from Bulgaria, and Greece acquiesced. They said, yes, we will withdraw from Bulgaria, showing, by the way, that this sort of international support of a sort of a global organization can work in terms of preventing conflict and preventing any kind of escalation. A similar kind of withdrawal in terms of claims came in 1924 when Turkey withdrew its claim to Mosul when the League supported Iraq, which was a British mandate at the time. Mosul, of course, is a city in Iraq. Turkey tried to claim that it was theirs, and the British under the British mandate, the Iraq mandate, believed it was actually part of the mandate for Iraq, and the League supported that decision, and Turkey withdrew its claim as a result in 1924. You could also make the point that there was the repatriation of about 400,000 World War I prisoners of war during this time period, as well as the support of Turkish refugees after 1922. So quite a lot of successful works, albeit modest successes during this time period in quite minor disputes. You've got a sort of island dispute, you've got a slight border dispute over the Upper Silesia region, a major withdrawal of forces after Greece withdrew from Bulgaria, which was a success, and sort of the post-war recovery and repatriation of around 400,000 World War I prisoners of war. In terms of their social, health, and humanitarian initiatives, you could say that the League had quite an excelled reputation during the 1920s. For example, the League of Nations did a lot of work combating slavery. In fact, it freed approximately 200,000 people from places like Burma. And it also targeted drug trafficking by blacklisting a number of offenders. It also had a very good record in terms of trying to deal with global health issues, for example, malaria and leprosy, and helped rebuild the economies in Hungary in 1923 and Austria in 1922. It established the institutions of the Permanent Court of Justice and the International Labour Organization, and health committees that were vital in conducting anti-disease campaigns. So, if you were to get an essay question asking about, inviting you to discuss the successes and failures of the League of Nations, you could divide the successes into sort of two paragraphs. You could talk about the sort of peacekeeping and border dispute successes and talk about Upper Silesia, the Ireland Islands, the Greco-Bulgarian disputes, the Iraq-Mosul dispute. And then you could talk about sort of humanitarian achievements, the combating of slavery, freeing around 200,000 slaves, the combating of malaria and leprosy, the rebuilding of economies in Austria and Hungary in 1922 and 1923, respectively. And then we can talk about some of the failures and limitations during this time period as well. One of the main problems was the fact that the League began to struggle with enforcement. There wasn't any enforcement power. It relied on the goodwill of states to accept the League's decisions. And so when powerful nations who had no obligation to accept the League decisions began to act against some of the decisions of the League, we can see that there was problems that was going to take place. For example, in 1920, Poland seized Vilna and ignored the League's order to withdraw. The League had no combating authority. It couldn't do anything to combat this violation of basic League principles, and so this went unchecked. Similarly, in 1923, Mussolini occupied the island of Corfu after an Italian diplomat was murdered, and the League again failed, and we have to see that Greece ended up having to compensate Italy under the Conference of Ambassadors' pressure. Again, this was another example of the League failing to do anything about these major issues. In 1923, when Germany failed to keep up with its reparations payments, both Belgium and France decided to occupy the Ruhr region, which is a sort of coal mining industrial region of Germany, without the League's consultation. And it reflected the fact that the League had nothing to say about this, and Germany had to essentially enact a policy known as passive resistance, where they would go on strike, the workers would go on strike, so that France could not extract any of the resources from that Ruhr region. And it ultimately leads to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 in Germany, in which the value of the German currency collapses. Again, this is a major problem that the League had no method to try and resolve. You could also argue that some of the disarmament methods and efforts were not very successful either. So, for example, the draft Treaty of Mutual Assistance, which was drafted in 1923, it proposed a system of collective security, but it was rejected by Britain. And you also have the Geneva Protocol, which also failed to gain any kind of ratification as well. So the disarmament efforts is one of those areas in which you can also talk about failures of the League of Nations. You could also make the point that there was a dependency on alternatives. We'll get to looking at that in the next lesson when we look at the work of other work of diplomacy outside the League of Nations during the 1920s, because that can also be evidence of the fact that the League of Nations wasn't particularly successful either, because there was successful treaties taking place that had nothing to do with the League of Nations. Again, another reflection of the League's failure to actually be an international system for global diplomacy.